Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to the Geotalk. So I'm going to introduce today's speaker, who is Amanda Ngwenya, who was an honors student here in our school 11 years ago, 2012. And since that time, he spent some time in the NGO space for the past 4 years. She's been in Denmark working for the Danish Energy Agency. So that's part of what you're talking about today. Brilliant. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Oh my word, it's so refreshing to be here after so long. You know, when I was getting dropped off by the Uber, I was like, my word, I'm not sure if I remember where to go. You know, like I had to reorientate myself. But just as the Uber drove in, it felt just like home. I knew exactly where to go. So I'm glad to be here today. And thank you so much for having me. And it's so nice to see Jill, Grant, everyone, Zube. It's unbelievable. And all of you haven't changed one bit, I should actually say. So I'll limit myself to this specific corner that I'm in, so that the people joining us on Zoom are able to hear me, so that I'm audible for them. But let me know if you guys in the room can also hear me properly, or if you need me to speak a little bit louder. But okay, so we'll get right into it. So the idea of mapping career opportunities in the energy sector essentially just stemmed from the idea that, you know, being a geology graduate myself, I was sitting in the seat that you guys are sitting in a few years ago. Now, as Zube has highlighted how many years ago that was, how dare he does that. So if you do a bit of reverse calculation, you would know my age. But I was hoping to go for a little bit younger today, but I guess not. But yeah, so we'll get right into it. So what I'll do, so I'm going to start with all right, so do I move using okay, there we go. So a quick agenda of what I will cover today is a quick introduction about myself, where I started, how I went from being in a seat like you are today to being where I am now, but also a little bit of a deep dive into what we do at the Danish Energy Agency and my role there, which really speaks to showing you what opportunities are out there, you know, just to encourage you as well and show you what's out there, to say just because you have a geology degree, you're not only limited to being an exploration geologist or a geophysicist, or, you know. So, and then we'll end with a little bit of a case study and technology options in the energy sector as well. All right, so a career summary. So my name is Amanda, as Zube rightly introduced me, and I started my first year in 2009. Here is when I was registered at Wits. And my majors were geology here at the School of Geosciences. And my second major was in ecology, environment and conservation in the School of Animal and Plant Sciences. So I did graduate somehow in record time in 2011 with my third year degree. You know, the students always used to have a joke at the time. I don't know if you guys still have it, about what pushes you to the edge. So I don't know which part of the edge you're on at the moment, but if you hang on tight, you'll get through it. All right. So, and then I joined the honors class in 2012. And really this, in the honors class is where we had a course on energy resources. And I think it was in that class actually that I started, you know, having an understanding of, you know, not only energy resources from a geological perspective, where we look at fossil fuels and so forth, but also an introduction, you know, and exposure to like renewable energy resources and understanding their role in the broader energy space. So I do always reference that course as the sort of where my, you know, brain started getting enlightened about, you know, what is this world, what's solar, what's wind, what happens, how does it feed in, and how does it link in to the bigger picture. So fast forward, after I graduate in 2012, in 2014, I joined the Climate Innovation Center, which is a program of the World Bank. That's housed in South Africa under the Innovation Hub, which is in Pretoria, and that's an agency of the government. So I started there as a graduate, and essentially like a learnership internship kind of program, and worked as a project coordinator after the internship. So I stayed on and became a project coordinator in the green economy, which essentially, and then later on became a portfolio manager within the green economy space, which essentially meant, you know, it was the business orientated side where we developed and deployed appropriate technologies that are looking at, that are focused on low carbon economies. And then did a short stint in the NGO space, about 6 months, before I left for Denmark in 2019. So 2019 is when I moved to Denmark. And what I moved to do was to study an MSc in sustainable energy engineering, seeing that my background had really, I solidified my background in the energy resource space, and I wanted to have a technical acumen as well within that fraternity. So given the geological background that I had, I majored in thermal gasification and pyrolysis, as well as energy systems modeling and scenario analysis. And that's what links directly to the work that I'm doing now currently, where I work as an advisor at the agency, specifically with the African and Asian market, where I'm working with South Africa and Indonesia. So the work that we do there is government to government, but you'll hear more about it as I go along. But essentially energy systems analysis and looking at the different energy options that we have and how to best meet the demands that we have, the energy demands we have in systems. And so obviously your geographical boundaries of how you do it is up to you as the modeler. But yeah, so essentially my career in working career was from the business orientated side of things, and now more on a government to government bilateral partnership. And I thought that, so this is actually supposed to have an animation. So oh, there we go. So what I thought is to add a picture here of Copenhagen, which is where I live now, and to inspire you and show you what it looks like on the other side of the world for those of you who want to travel at some point. It's a beautiful city. In the summer, it comes alive, and this is like, you know, the canal. So this is what I call home. It looks this beautiful in the summer, but winters, maybe not so much. So we always are looking forward to the summer. All right. So now that you know a little bit about me, I thought I would ask, you know, just to see who we have in the room in terms of the students. I know all the professors and I see them walking in as well. It's so lovely to see you guys. So just from the students' perspective, to get an idea, do we have any first years, or is it more like honors students in the room? So maybe by a show of hands, maybe let's start with postgrads. Are there any postgrads in the room? Just by a show of hands. Okay, so honors. Okay, lovely. And then the rest, third year, second year, where are we? Okay, so that's actually some second. All right, all right. Any first year? Okay, I would have said that is very ambitious. I like that you're looking at career opportunities at that stage. But so this is quite spot on, right? So it's great to see that you guys are in the room. And have you guys, I'm sure you've started thinking about it, and that's why you would have come to a talk such as this on mapping career opportunities. When you think of your career and when you think of where do you want to be in the next 3 years or post your graduation, or be it in the next 5 years, where do you see yourself? So this is an actual open question to you guys. If you just raise your hand, or maybe just, you know, if some of you are brave enough to let us know where you see yourself. Is it exploration? Do you want to be a geophysicist? Where do you see yourself? Is anyone brave enough to answer the question? And it could also be that you see yourself on stage as a singer, right? So there's no right or wrong answer. That's also okay. The lectures, the lectures. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone with an answer? Where do you see yourself in the next few years? Or what, at least what you aspire, where, you know, what's your aspiration? Yes.
So I see myself doing my master's, especially the field of
Okay.
whether
Okay. Yeah. All right. That's lovely. That's sort of the route that one of our classmates at the time, Tumeleng Mohatusi, followed, and that's actually the space that she's in. So it would be nice. I should probably connect you to her, and she can give you some advice on how to go about it. And we have a few other students that did the same in the honors class. But okay, so that's interesting, right? And so if you do a quick Google study or a Google search, which I did for you, to see, because I was like, you know, it's it might be different how it was 11 years ago when I did it and how it looks like now. But it seems like everything still seems the same. Nothing has changed much. So when you look at the job options for a geology degree, when you go onto Google, the responses that you'd see that are directly related to your geology degree are exactly what you've mentioned, right? So you see geohydrologists, you see wildlife geologists, geochemists, geophysicists. So this is what we see as the traditional career paths for geology graduates, and which is lovely, right? Because these are really technical needs that we need, right? Because everything, and if we speak energy, right, it's the geologists that are involved in the exploration and the mining, and it takes all of this to make it happen. And also from an industrial point of view, you know, as you rightfully mentioned, you could be in corporate, right? Be it oil, mining, environmental engineering, but you could also work in nonprofit or NGOs. And there are also opportunities in the government space, such as where I work, and also in academia, right? And so, yeah, so those are the options that you see out there. And generally, I gravitated towards what you would see, and this is just a schematic showing how all of that links together, right? But I gravitated towards natural resources and specifically energy resources. So when we go into energy resources specifically, and I understood that the course is not actually running anymore. But well, maybe today would be motivation to get that course going, right? Someone benefited from it. Right. So really the question is, when you ask yourself, what are energy resources? Why do we need them? Why are they important, right? So according to the US Department of Energy, they define it as primary energy sources that can take many forms. And these forms include nuclear energy, fossil energy, such as oil, coal, natural gas, renewable sources such as wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower. And they take it a step further to say that these primary resources are converted. And this is really the why, right? Why are we actually looking at all these energy resources? Why do they matter? And they take it a step further to mention that they're converted to electricity and secondary energy sources, which then the electricity will then flow through power lines and other transmission infrastructure, to i.e. power homes and rooms like where we are today. So the summary of that definition is essentially that energy is important and we need it to power our world, but also to meet other energy demands, right? If you got to class today, you drove your car, but to get that engine going, you needed someone to mine some oil, or, you know, to explore for some oil and get that oil up and then get some gasoline out of that. So essentially, the primary energy resources, as we see according to these definitions, are divided into fossil fuel, nuclear, and renewable energy resources. And I always say that and this is something I believe, that we always like to separate fossil fuels and label them as non-renewable, but in actual fact, they are renewable, right? Because they are renewable because they do regenerate. The only difference is that we have to wait for some dinosaur to die somewhere, and a few other people get compacted a few billion years, and then we have them. So where the problem is that they're not necessarily renewable in our lifetime. So if we use them the way that we do, so it is a finite resource, and they don't regenerate within the lifetime, or at least that we use them in. And that's why there's a focus that you guys might have seen nowadays about renewables and fossil fuels. And when you look at it in the media, it's always like, oh, it's actually like a battle, what must win? And how we look at it as energy engineers is that it's actually a complementary thing. It's not really about what's better than the other, but it's really about how do we use our resources in the best way possible? How do we use our resources where best applicable? Let's put it that way. And really, fossil fuels are potent energy sources, right? And you want to apply them where they're best applied. Okay, so with that, the aim today is, of course, like I mentioned, to say, where can you go within the energy resource fraternity? All right, so just to bring it back, you know, I'm asking a question here saying, where in the world are we? And I don't mean geographically, I know we're in South Africa. But just in terms of what has happened in the past few years, right? So you know what has happened, right? It's no brainer. 2019, COVID-19 hit, and we had a terrible time in 2019 and 2020. And in 2021, when we thought we were through it and we were looking at a trajectory, it brought its own challenges, right? And then we saw the emergence of more transmissible variants of the virus. And what that meant is that recovery in many countries, because obviously after countries went through the economic downhill, everyone was trying to recover and go on an economic uphill, right? But then that in itself was so difficult and challenging in 2021. It put pressure on utilities to actually rebound economically, which translated to pressure on supply chain all around the world, right? And what we saw is a drastic increase in commodity prices. And if some of you follow commodity prices, you would have noticed that. But then in addition to that, you know, the prices were so high, and we started asking ourselves, what is the actual increase, right? And if you then fast forward to 2022, we know that the war in Ukraine broke out, and that in itself was the further effect. And specifically in the case of Europe, the fossil fuel prices skyrocketed. The price of natural gas was off the roof. And just to give you an example of my home structure, our electricity bill used to be about, let's say, 1,500 krona, and when the war hit, that went to about 4,000 krona. And that's about a three and a half people home. So it was off the roof. And what that meant was, there was a lot of panic, just in terms of what happens now. And that meant this actually developed into a fully fledged crisis in Europe, but not only from a price perspective, but also the storage level remained constantly low during the summer period, which actually then meant that if storage levels were so low, we had no, that means our reserves are low, right? And we were not sure what's going to happen in the winter. So what the countries were trying to do, especially in the case of Denmark, is actually fill up the storage and fill up the gas storage so that we actually have enough resources to take us through the winter. Because when winter hits is when we're using so much heating and we've got so many electronics and stuff that on. So the energy demand skyrockets. But then what that meant is that there was a significant concern both about the prices, but also just about availability of the resource itself, right? And so, and if we actually then fast forward to 2023 and look at what happened in 2023, we see that quite recently, this is this month actually, and you guys might have already seen that the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which includes countries that have a lot, that generally hold the large share of oil around the world, made an announcement that they would be cutting or at least reducing the amount of oil that they are producing per day. So what does that mean? And we know that from general, and maybe just before I get there, but then maybe what we should also look at is how the prices then changed once they made those announcements. So just when we thought it was over with COVID and, the Ukraine situation is stabilizing, then we have this hit as well. So what we see is a lot of volatility in the markets is what I'm getting at. And generally what happens when you cut output is that the prices skyrocket, right? And this is based on basic economics, based on the demand and supply curve. So we know that if we had a resource and that resource was in good supply, then that helps you bring down. So I don't know how much, maybe what I should do is take a step back. I'm not sure how much economics, basic economics, and maybe energy economics, but maybe just to put it into perspective, is that so you have a demand curve that goes that way, right? And if you look at it here, it's the same thing. It's a demand curve, but it's just a straight curve, and then you have a supply curve, right? So as you can see there, demand curve, supply curve. So what generally happens is that the equilibrium price of the market is set where your supply curve and your demand curve meets, right? So when you have a situation that we have now, where supply is decreased, what automatically happens, that means your demand actually increases, right? And when your demand increases, that means that we're moving along the supply curve, we're moving towards the top of the supply curve. And when that happens, this equilibrium price, for example, say we were here, say our demand curve was crossing supply here, this would have been our equilibrium price, right, per unit of whatever commodity you were looking at. But then, of course, as the demand continues to increase, then so does the price. We see that price is actually increasing. So this explains what we're seeing in the markets today. And really, if you want to read about it, you can go into the news sources and read more about that and other news. But what that brings us to, and what that really paints a picture about, is energy security. So what all of this has done in the past few years, at least in the energy sector, is really draw the attention of governments around the world towards energy security. So it's something that has been prioritized, and that goes hand in hand with decarbonization. We've been seeing a lot of countries putting together their NDC targets and their decarbonization strategies. How do we meet net zero by 2050? Companies are pledging to meet net zero by 2050. And really the focus has been on reduction of greenhouse gases. But now the different scenarios that have played over the past few years have made us rethink and reprioritize. Energy security is always a priority, but it just makes you reprioritize and think, oh, heck, it's one thing to reach net zero, but then we need to do it in a way where we can be as energy secure as we can, but also even increase your energy independence. And so that sort of brings me into the segue of what I do and where I work, who we are. and what we do. And so I work for the Danish Energy Agency, which is a government agency under the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. So I'm in the government space in Denmark. And the DEA is the technical administrator for the energy sector in Denmark, where we look at different fraternities as it speaks to energy. So we're both from the utility supply, systems analysis, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so forth. And I represent a unit within the agency known as the Global Corporation, where we take all the technical expertise that is done in-house in Denmark, and we cooperate with different countries around the world, and we export that technical expertise. So we cooperate currently with 24 partner countries around the world. We've got partners in the Americas. We've got partners in the Asia, as well as a lot more partners in Europe. And as you can see, we're building a footprint as well in Africa, with South Africa being one of the long-standing partnerships of the corporation. So essentially what we do is take the competencies within the energy sector in Denmark and spread them, or capacity build and share knowledge and collaborate with these different countries. And what we do in the different countries is of course also tailor-made and demand-driven. We work on a demand-driven program. And so what that means is what we would do, for example, in the US or Mexico might be slightly different, or sometimes even totally different to what we're doing in Japan or in Turkey, or for example, in the UK. Because the different markets are looking at different energy sources. And for example, in the US, the program is very focused on offshore wind and developing offshore wind technologies. Whereas maybe in Indonesia, we're looking more at how do we reach net zero and what are the different technology options that are available, and modeling exercises, and it would be different for the different countries. And in the UK, there's also a strong partnership on district heating and so forth. So, however, and so really the question becomes, why are we partnering with all these 24 countries around the world? And a big part of it is that Denmark as a country represents only 0.1% of the global emissions and only represents 0.07% of the world's population. So even if we went totally green in Denmark, it would only be a dent to the energy transition. And that's why by partnering with the different countries that we do, we get to have a larger footprint. And also a story to tell behind that is that, you know, speaking of the crises that we're seeing now within the energy sector, in 1973, there was an oil crisis, but most of us in the room were not born yet, so we might not know the story. But then that crisis in itself is where Denmark started developing technology in the wind space specifically, and starting to prioritize energy security. So what happened at that time in 1973 in Denmark was that when the oil crisis at that time hit, Denmark found itself in a scarcity situation. There was basically hardly any oil, and they had to stop all transportation, and only cars could actually drive on the road. So at that point, they then realized, hang on, we have to be energy secure. We cannot rely on another country. We have to work with the resources we have. And what are those resources that we have? And they realized that wind was something that they could look at, and that's something they then have developed in the plus 40 years since then. And today, the rest of the world gets to benefit from that development that has happened in Denmark, because now the prices, the learning curves have, we can benefit from them. And so part of the system targets that actually drive the Danish system, as we can see here, is to actually have 100% green electricity by 2030. This is the target of the Danish government as we speak. So they have decommissioned some coal plants, and they continue to do so. But we still do have thermal capacity in the system. Climate neutrality by 2050 is a big goal, and this is, I think, a shared goal amongst many countries. And as well as a 70% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, and a 55% share in renewable energy total consumption by 2030, with a 3% curtailment of wind and a security of supply of 99.99%. So that means, in a Danish context, that per year, there's a chance of 20%, 20 minutes where you will have no electricity. But in the 4 years that I've been there, I'm yet to see those 20 minutes. So in actual fact, I think this is the Danes being modest. It's more, it's almost a 100% supply, right? So, but what that means is this is what drives the whole idea of energy security, and this is what shows that, you know, we can actually have variable energy resources powering our energy needs and still reach some sort of high security of supply. All right. And the core competencies are really looking at, you know, as I said in the first slide, how do the energy resources that we have in our system complement each other? What resources do you have? And because we work on a government to government, so we work on a country level. So we look at what energy resources as an energy modeler, we look at what energy resources do we have in our systems and how, what needs can we meet with what? And what I mean by that is you always want to match your energy needs to the least cost option, because you want it to be a benefit for the society, right? Because it's not about just meeting a need with the most expensive energy, but it's saying, how do we do it in a sustainable way, but how is it still making sure that it's economic and that society doesn't bear a high cost for these energy technologies? And so we develop different scenarios, you know, scenarios where you look at it, for example, a pathway where if you stay, for example, with certain resources in your energy system, what does that look like? And not only electricity, I know that what you saw before focused a lot on electricity, but like I said earlier, you need energy for everything, right? Both for electricity production, but in industry, you need energy both for heating sources, but also as a raw material and so forth. So you think about where can we best apply certain technologies and certain energy resources, and where does it make sense to do so? And we build scenarios. And after you do that, then you look at as well as the economics, right? And we do this using different models. But then linked to that, the more you integrate, for example, in an electricity grid, the more you integrate renewable energy resources, you need to find a way to do that, to integrate that energy in a way that still keeps the grid stable. And this is a big thing that a lot of electrical engineers spend their time on, and trying to make sure that the grid is balanced at 50 hertz and so forth. But so essentially flexibility in power stations, and also energy efficiency and district heating, and things that then go in hand and part of the competencies that we share. So this is a sum up slide of what I've just said. So in terms of, you know, really those scenario building and looking at your energy system, that takes a lot of planning and a lot of political consensus. But then also it's about, you know, how connected are you to your neighbor? For example, if it's an electricity grid that we're looking at, but also how flexible are your generation systems, and how are you able to forecast and to plan for these scenarios? So to bring it down to South Africa, since I did mention that this is one of the partner countries that we work with, we partner directly with the Department of Energy and Mineral Resources. And that is also part of where you see the nexus between what we do, although what you do is, or as geologists, as future geologists, right? From ensuring that the energy resource is made available first by exploring for it, where it's fossil-based, and then by mining it and making it over the market, right? And the supply chains that come with that. And as well as Eskom, and that's why we also have this focus on electricity. But essentially, and part of what we do, and the difference between a resource that comes from a fossil fuel is what I just mentioned, right? There's this exploration, mining, and ensuring it's distributed and it's where it needs to be used. For example, say in a coal power plant or in an industry where it needs to be used. But the difference is part of our activities that we do on the renewable energy side of things is actually mapping resource potential. So even though it's a renewable resource, if it's solar and it's wind and it's not that, and it's infinite in a sense, right? But you still need to know how much solar do we have in this place, or how much wind is blowing at a certain place. So part of some of the projects that we do is exactly that, and that's what we're involved in at the moment, where we're mapping the resource potential for wind in Mpumalanga, as well as Limpopo province, what we call as the Wind Atlas for South Africa. We're actually in the 4th phase of that project, because there is the Wind Atlas, and it's been done before, but now we're concentrating on those 2 provinces based on the energy transition agenda that is in that area specifically. But also we're starting to do the wind measurements at a higher mast level, because now there's better technologies and there's different, you know, developments within, both from the turbine perspective, but also from perspective, they can build them out higher. And the theory, or at least the hypothesis at this point, is that the higher you go, then you have better resource potential. but we'll know when we have the results, of course. But we also work on procurement and holistic planning and a few more very electricity sector related outputs. And that's specifically with Eskom. So just to go back to the energy parts, so I mentioned that we use these different models, and within the energy planning, these are the different types of models that you find. There are more out there, but the main ones, for example, are LEAD, times, as well as energy plan, and there are other models. It's not limited to that. And the idea is you have economic and technical streams that you feed into these models. And the idea is really to determine what the optimal investment decisions are for capacity expansion, what generation sources do we look at, and what are the total system costs of the capacity expansion. And so the rest are more power, heat, and heat sector related. And then for the grid operators, this is what they use. And also quite importantly, is models that also look at security of supply, because like I mentioned, energy security is a priority right now. All right, and just to give you a quick overview, very quick overview of how all of this comes into play. When you feed this information into your models, so whatever source of energy that you're looking at will compete, right? Because if we're looking at price, then they're competing on a price basis, right? And obviously other technical considerations that have to be looked at, be it capacity factors or efficiencies of these plants. So there's many more technical aspects that are looked at. But essentially, you would have a technology catalog where your fossil fuels, be it oil, gas, would also compete with your technology or renewable energy technology such as solar, geothermal, wind, and these different technologies with all the aspects that you would consider from a technical aspect, from an economic aspect, your capexes, your opexes, your variable operating costs, and so forth, would go into this, would all be fed into this model. And as you can see, some would need conversion, especially where fossil fuels are oil and gas is concerned, or coal. Where that's concerned, you would need some conversion. And essentially what you get out of it would be your power demand, right? You would know what demand you need, and you would know what your total requirements for your system are, and what the cost of those systems would be, where you would need to add capacity, where you would need to add transmission. So, and that is really where the argument and what you would see used to be, because for the longest time, renewables were just not competitive from an economic perspective. But now fast forward, 10 years, 20 years later, where we were in 2010 and where we were before that and where we are now is a complete difference. And if we look only at a comparison between 2020 and 2021, we can see that utility scale solar voltaic prices dropped by 13%. And for offshore wind is the same. It's a decrease in 13%. And this information, the source is IRENA in their power sector catalog. And onshore wind also dropped by 15%, and PFP as well, as we can see here, is an actual increase. So it's not, at least in this study, and this is based on the LCOEs of these technologies. So, and this is also a global weighted average. And what LCOEs is essentially saying the levelized cost of electricity, because as you would imagine, it would be unfair to compare the cost of electricity produced from wind or from coal on an only production perspective. So when we look at the LCOE, what we look at is the actual levelized cost of electricity, where you say, if we're to look at them both on a one-to-one perspective, where you consider all their costs from CAPEX and not only their marginal cost, where you're not only looking at a cost of how much does it cost to produce from the technology, because then wind would also win if we looked at it that way, because it's essentially free, right? Or solar, because there's no fuel cost, right? So you look at it in a way where you consider the investment cost that is required for these technologies, the production cost, and these different flows that you would look at, economic factors, to be able to compare them on an almost one-to-one perspective. And so when we speak about LCOE, it's a comparative measure of actually comparing between the different technologies, regardless of what you're looking at. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, Zubir. Please do feel free to tell me to stop if I've gone over. But so essentially, just to show you what that looks like, if we look at where we were in 2010, and where we are now, right? So around about 22. So, and this is comparing the solar PV specifically to fossil gas. And you can see how those prices looked in 2010. There was almost no investment case, right, for solar. It couldn't compete with fossil fuels. It couldn't compete with coal. And now we see that the learning curve from for the technology has been so great. And now those prices have really come down. And what we see today is an actual cross. And this cross that we highlighted, you know, what happened in 2020 and 21, so we know why. But so today, in today's time, we actually see that the price for fossil gas is all the way up there. And we can see that we're looking at less than 0.1 USD per kilowatt hour for PV. So now renewables really have become competitive. And so there's a lot of aggression in terms of actually scaling them up and actually deploying a lot of renewable energy resources out there. So I put together a little bit of a case study and also just to showcase what technologies we're looking at when we speak about decarbonization and what else, what other fuels can we look at? What can we reserve oil for? What can we reserve gas for? What can we, you know, where can we substitute and so forth? And the case study is, you know, also looking at what's the alternative that's being considered in Denmark and also in some areas around the world. And in comes in green hydrogen. Have you guys heard of green hydrogen? Yes. What's the difference? Do you know what makes it green? Do you know? Louder. I can't hear you in the corner. Yeah. Tell us what makes it green. Uh-huh. Yeah. The fact that there's no greenhouse gases, right? There's no CO2 being emitted from it. There we go. So it looks like someone is already looking at the energy sector and diversifying. So that's essentially it, right? So when we look at the comparison between, because I mean, the world, we do need gas. That's a no-brainer. We do need all forms of energy sources that we have. And the difference between green hydrogen and the other forms of hydrogen is that brown hydrogen is essentially a hydrogen that's produced from coal or lignites, and then it goes through processing and sometimes gasification, and I'll get to that in a different slide. But essentially, you know, the production of hydrogen from it does produce CO2, and it emits more CO2 than gray hydrogen in actual fact. And gray hydrogen is actually, I think, the most produced actual form of hydrogen, and that's from natural gas through the process of steam reforming, and that process also itself produces CO2. So that's why it's not considered a green hydrogen. But then blue hydrogen is a form of taking either gray or brown hydrogen. So essentially taking the hydrogen from natural gas, all that's produced from coal, and then adding carbon capture to that. So actually capturing that carbon so that it's not emitted into the air. And then that eliminates most of the emissions, at least from the process. And they call that blue hydrogen, but the source itself is still either coal or gas. And then green hydrogen is now actually quite different, where we're looking at electrolysis of water. So there's no raw material from natural gas or from coal in that case. So it's simply electrolyzing water, and it's a CO2 neutral process. So now you know the difference, right? So when you hear people say green hydrogen, you now know what it is. All right. And so you might have heard of more colors, right? Because sometimes people are confused. They're like, oh my word, what are we talking about? There's green, there's purple, there's yellow. There's so many things happening. And I think this is a really good, this is a good schematic that shows, and this is the source that you can see there. So you can always go back to it to take a look. But essentially this explains what we're saying in the previous slide, where your black and gray hydrogen, and you can see there's actually an intermediate in between, which is a brown hydrogen, are essentially either from coal or natural gas with a process where there's gasification if it's coal, and natural gas reforming or pyrolysis for the natural gas version. But then both processes still do produce some greenhouse gases. And that's why we're trying to move now into what we know as green hydrogen, where there's no GHG footprint, or at least it's very minimal. But in between that, before we get there, is pink and yellow, and that's essentially green hydrogen that is powered, which is essentially a form of hydrogen production that is powered, still water electrolysis, but then it's powered by nuclear or a mixed grid. So what you see by this example is that, so essentially to make it green, the source of electricity powering the electrolysis must be renewable. So that's what makes it green, because then you're not actually, you don't have any downstream emissions. So in a case where you do have downstream emissions, it's not actually then green anymore. So it has to be powered by either solar or wind or other forms of renewables that have no production emissions. And so what do we do, like right now in Denmark, we're looking at, and so what you've also heard of is the process known as, at least this whole process of taking power and producing. So as you saw right in that previous slide, we're taking power, producing power and using that power to electrolyze water to produce, to break the two, the hydrogen and the oxygen, so that we get the hydrogen, and that's what we call the green hydrogen. So essentially, that process or processes such of that sort are termed power to X, which is essentially saying we're taking electricity and we're taking electricity to an X product. That X could be green hydrogen, it could be other synthetic fuels. And the reason we do it that way is if decarbonization is a strategy that we're looking at currently for the energy sector, the best way we know how right now to decarbonize is via electricity, because electricity is the cheapest form to decarbonize. As you will see when I explain some of the applications of green hydrogen, that right now it's cheaper to decarbonize using electricity, because we're able to get electricity from fuel sources that have no cost, such as wind, such as so there's no fuel costs, but you have, of course, the technology cost and the plant development cost. But then that in itself is an advantage towards decarbonization. But then when we talk about electrifying, it has to then, of course, be renewable so that it's cost competitive. And also because of efficiency. Efficiency is a very big thing, because if you then, and I'll show you in the next slide, but essentially the pathways for this green hydrogen that we spoke about, so it falls under this power to X and the indirect, usage of electricity. So as I mentioned, you can electrify certain use cases where we need energy and we need to meet energy demand. You can electrify directly, and you can do that in the transport sector. If you come to the Nordics, if you come to Norway, you'll be surprised to see how many EVs are driving around. And same thing in Denmark. When I got there, I always used to be surprised because I'll see people's cars plugged in overnight, and you're walking in the streets and people's cars are plugged everywhere. And I would think, oh my word, what would happen if we left our cars like this in South Africa? But I don't know, only you can tell me, right? But let's see how we'll deal with that when we start to scale up EVs in South Africa. But so this is the thing, right? So you can electrify your transport system, and you can do so in a very economic way. You can electrify, of course, already like households and heating, and you can electrify many things, as well as some processes, industrial processes. But where you can't use direct electricity, also where you need like high temperature processes that you actually can't electrify, then that's where, at some where we do consider indirect electrification and power to X. And this in comes green hydrogen, right? So you can see there, you would use your electricity from a renewable plant, from a renewable source, to electrify an electrolysis plant, and then you would have your hydrogen. And you can either use hydrogen directly as well, as you mentioned, right? As you mentioned in the corner that Anglo is using hydrogen from some of its fleet. So you can use it directly for some of your for your transportation needs, and directly in industry as a raw material. But then you can also upgrade it, what we call upgrading it, where you then take source of hydrocarbon from biomass, and then upgrade your hydrogen to produce synfuels. so that you still get a sort of hydrocarbon-based e-fuel, which is similar to the functionality of like your gasoline, and that's where you can also produce aviation fuels. And that's what you can use for cargo, for shipping, for heavy industry. So this is a general schematic showing the use cases of green hydrogen. And this is a schematic showing how it's produced, which is what we've just explained, that you would have a renewable energy source, and you would have electrolysis of water happening at a plant. And then to be able to transport your hydrogen, you would either compress or liquefy it. So you would have compression or liquefaction, and then you would transport it to your use area. And then your hydrogen actually can act as a battery for renewable energy and can be used for many situations. So you have also heard of hydrogen then being used for, when they say as the battery, what they then do, there are applications where they then look at so there's a theory as well. I don't know if you've heard of, not a theory, it's an actual practice that is happening right now in Denmark, where Denmark is planning to build what you call energy islands. And these energy islands are essentially a centralized form of renewable energy power, where they will build mini offshore wind farms, and combine these wind farms into what you call an energy island, and transport that energy back to the shore. So what that means is it creates an even better business case for the renewable energy production, because when times where you have high production and you've met your demand, instead of curtailing that production, what you can then do is produce hydrogen. Because what you will also see in a slide that I will show you, I think, okay, it's about maybe 2 slides away, but we'll get to it, is that what you will see is that really the business case for hydrogen sits in the price of the electricity that you use to electrolyze your water. So, and this goes back to the idea of efficiency and saying, we know what we need to consider as we look at energy sources and meeting our energy needs around the world is the efficiency of these fuels. So a quick example in context is that if you're to apply a gigawatt of offshore wind, you could actually supply power directly to a million households, or 1.5 power 1.5 electric vehicles. But if you went through power 2x conversion process, what you would do is end up only supplying power to 250,000 homes. So you can see what that efficiency loss is. And that's why we say that you want to reserve, for example, your potent energy sources such as oil and gas, where you can use them directly and where it makes sense to use them. So you're not using it for a process generating power where you have other sources that you can use it, but you want to use it where it's best applicable. And so you can also see what the efficiency loss becomes when you go through P2X. So that means you want to use your green hydrogen only as well. So it's not a one size fits all solution. You want to ensure that you're also applying that green hydrogen to only cases where it makes sense to do so, where you have no other alternatives, where electrification or direct electrification was not an option. All right. And so this is a pyramid that essentially explains what I've just mentioned, which is that, you want to look at different stages and the priority of use for your different energy sources. You can use, of course, of energy efficiency, electrifying, maybe using hydrogen, but really going up a food chain and a pyramid where you know that you're using your best applicable energy resource to meet that energy demand. And this also explains what you saw in the previous schematic, where at least in the Danish case, the application for green hydrogen and synthetic fuels is currently being reserved for shipping and aviation. So we're not considering it for the power sector at all, because it just doesn't make sense from an efficiency perspective. It doesn't make sense from an economic perspective to use it in that sector. So currently it's only being used, it's only being looked at for transportation. But then, of course, and this is where the robust potential for it is being seen. And also I should highlight that also in industry, right, where it can actually be a raw material, there's also a use case for green hydrogen. But different countries have different methodology, well, not really, at least applications and different test cases of where they want or prefer to use the green hydrogen. So these are some objectives, but because I'll share the slides in the interest of time, I'll jump that. And I want to get to this quick slide where we look at the actual price. And so, you know, when you think about those colors, remember all that whole color chart that we looked at, we'll focus on three, which is the green hydrogen, the blue hydrogen, and the gray. So because it's still a very new technology, there's still a lot of research and development being done. The prices still need to become more competitive. They're not yet competitive as we speak. So you can see that the green hydrogen right now is much more expensive in terms of krona per kg of green hydrogen in comparison to gray hydrogen or even blue hydrogen. And if you remember, blue was the one where you add carbon capture. But then it is expected that around 2030, between 2030 and 25, we will see a shift where gray hydrogen becomes much more expensive and green hydrogen becomes cheaper. And these are essentially just two scenarios of green hydrogen, where there's one where there's an expected faster decrease in the prices, and another one that is a little bit more linear. So, and really what we see here is that the supporting mechanisms and policy frameworks must be in place for these technologies to become economically competitive. All right, I'll skip these in the interest of time and just leave this with you to say, you know, in terms of when we look at these alternative technologies, electrification is the best way we know how to decarbonize. And both from a technology perspective, the technologies exist, the technologies are proven, and green hydrogen is best in certain applications, not all, and shouldn't be really looked at as a it's here to fix everybody's problem. And they are, of course, you can upgrade the green hydrogen, combine it with some hydrocarbon source to create green fuels that are very similar to the fuels as we know now. But also as geologists, right, what is more important and what comes into play when we talk about this green transition and we talk about sustainability is really looking at the needs from a critical minerals perspective. And these needs from a critical minerals perspective, so like some of the technologies I've highlighted, like EVs, or some of the power generation technologies like solar, or the electrolyzers that we spoke about for hydrogen, all these technologies require critical minerals. And you know, there's a lot of work that's being done right now by the International Energy Agency, as well as IRENA, and many other research centers, and I'm sure maybe within Wits as well in a different school. There are units that are looking at what are these mineral flows that are required to meet these needs. And this still remains the question to be answered, right? We know what the mineral flows are, what the critical minerals that are required. And these prices are actually increasing as we see in the past few years, and you'll see that in the next slide. But then this is, I think, something that you should also think about in your own work when we look at, you know, what are these critical minerals that we will need to meet this sort of energy demand system, and how does that look in comparison to the continued unsustainable use of the resources that we have, such as oil or gas, together. And just to give you perspective of some of those commodities that you saw, right? For example, you have nickel there, which goes into technologies such as EVs, and it also goes into like batteries. And in the case of South Africa, as you can see, we're actually part of the top countries that are being looked at and earmarked for the energy transition because of our great platinum resources. And I remember when I was here, we used to talk a lot about the I can see I see you guys are nodding and like, yes, okay. There we go. But so this is part of the pride, it's part of our pride as South Africa, right? And countries around the world are in a lot of discussions about how do you mine these resources, because then we're just moving from one resource burden to another, right? Where we will need to meet these demands with heavy mineral resources, but then these resources are also not infinite, right? So we're back to like a same cycle program. And that's why we have bright minds like you in the room to help us figure out these problems. And luckily in the case of South Africa, like there are countries where the Department of Mineral Resource Department is separate from the energy resource. So luckily in the case of South Africa, we have it as one. So I don't know if that makes it better or worse. That's for you to decide. But yeah, so basically from a commodity price perspective as well, what we see is that in what we saw at least in 22 is that the price of nickel changed by almost 50%. It went up and even higher than that later than this publication. It even went higher than that. The natural gas prices also skyrocketed. So you can see that there's a lot of volatility in the markets. So that doesn't take us away from the volatility that we see, like for example, in the oil and gas market, because we still have volatility in the critical minerals market as well. All right, so I decided to leave you guys with a few pictures of the work that we get up to when we go to these different plants. And because we work on government to government cooperation, you can see our partners from ESCOM, and we work a lot with under the ministry and ministers and ministerials in different countries with the ambassador as well. This is the Danish ambassador to South Africa, and that's us in a meeting with our partners, but also on study tours with our partners, and really, you know, taking the colleagues around to show the different applications of different technologies and how we can meet different energy needs in different ways. And these are my colleagues that I actually work with that are part of the team that's supporting Team South Africa. So you can see me somewhere there. And I think that's my old LinkedIn picture. And these are the great and awesome people that I work with to make the work that we do actually happen. So yeah, without further ado, thank you so much for having me.
Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Yeah. Yep. I have to go to the mic first.
No pressure.
Thank you for a wonderful talk once again. So I just wanted to know, what were the challenges you faced with changing from South Africa to Denmark, and how did your family take it? Because you know, our African families, they're not really welcoming to such an idea of moving abroad. And yeah, how did you navigate around that?
Yeah, great question. I like that you're like, okay, forget all the technical socially, how did you deal with it? That's a good question. And I guess that also is a question that you had to also answer at some point when you made the decision to come to the University of the Witwatersrand over another university. You know, some of you had to move cities and towns. But to answer the question, so it's never an easy decision to make. Relocation is always a difficult choice. It's always a difficult decision because you leave your normal, you leave your space of comfort, you leave the people you love. But now, you know, the other aspect is that the world is so connected nowadays. You've got access to video calls, because think about it, you're at Wits the whole year. How often are you home? Unless you live at home, you're not at home, you're not seeing them every day. You're seeing them maybe on weekends or maybe once a month. And for some of you who might be from the Cape or Limpopo, then you see them only on holidays, right? So you see them 3 times a year. So I think there's just a sense of independence that you gain at some point, and where you make a decision that is career-based for yourself and what you want to do, but also the contribution that you want to make to the world. You know, you make a decision about, is this where I want to contribute, and is this how best I can contribute at this space and at this time? And it's a changing answer, right? The answer I had then, it may be in a different context, in a different set of scenarios and circumstances would be different. So it's never a one size fit all, but I think it's something that you just always have to keep in mind, and the balance that you somehow always have to strike between, do I want to live in comfort? I can always take a flight every second month or every 4th month or once a quarter and visit my family, and nothing would have changed. Trust me, my dad looks the same way he looked 4 years ago. And so some things do change, but then, like I'm saying, we're in a connected world. You pick up a video call. I have a video call with my family almost on a daily basis when I arrive. Sometimes some days are busier. It doesn't happen every day, but we still touch, and then I'm here, and it's like I never left. And so I think you can maintain it. You just have to plan for it. You just have to plan for it. And I think one of your other questions was challenge. I think the biggest challenge is dealing with paperwork. Administration will be the death of me in general. So if the administrative part where you have to deal with paperwork, I should also say I really work with the integration has been so much better, I guess, than if I didn't have to work with such great people. But I really work with great people, and Denmark specifically people. So integration in Denmark has been I don't want to say a breeze, but it has been, except the gray clouds. If we forget the skies and the weather outside, it's been a good integration.
Okay, have you got? Mike.
Hi.
Thank you for the lovely talk. I'm not really quite sure how to phrase my question, but I'm just gonna blurt out whatever is coming at me.
Yeah.
So it's DEA.
Mhm.
How exactly do you, oh, I'm sorry. How exactly do you guys like work? Do you like with the companies? You said you have like 24
Countries, yeah.
countries that you guys work with. Do you like guys design the, I don't know what to call them, but come up with an approach on how they can do that, and then do you guys implement that approach, or do you just leave it to them to try and implement it, like given the politics in that country and all that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a
that's
very
about it.
that's a very good question. That's a spot on question. And so essentially how we work is that because it's partnerships, it's a bilateral. So how we work in the different countries is a bilateral partnership that is signed at ministerial level. So the ministers will sit and they'll decide what areas that rule that country, and based on the decision we would also pick the different partners that we will work with that are generally under the ministry. And our aim is really, at least the work that we do, is really capacity building and sharing knowledge and the experience that Denmark has gained over the past 40 years. So it's up to each sovereign country to make a decision on what they would like to do, and we're essentially there as an advisory or as the person you can bounce ideas off. Like, for example, say they're considering something and they're not sure how did it work in another country, how can it best work, then we're able to bring the Danish experience and the Danish technologies and say this is how it worked in a Danish context. When we're integrating, for example, I'll give an example of integration of renewable energy resources, right? So when you actually shift your grid, when you start to, as you start to feed in more renewable energy into the grid, your grid has to be still stable, right? So, and because variables by nature, renewables by nature, like for example, solar and wind are variable, right? So they're doing this and you need your supply to be constant, right? So there's a lot of technical work that has to be done. And for example, there's learnings that Denmark has gone through in like learning and doing, the way they've failed and they've won and it has worked. And when they started, when their engineers started years ago, like 20, 40 years ago, they also had cases where they thought there's no way we can integrate more than 2%. 2%, that's what we can do. Otherwise, after that, the grid fails. And then they pushed the boundaries and they got to 10%, and then they got to 30%, and they got to now this 50% that we see, and even higher now in time. So in that is a book of technical learnings, essentially. And that's what then happens where in the different countries, we sit peer to peer with the technical people, we'll sit with the technical people, and the engineers to engineer, peer to peer will sit and say, okay, this is how you did this and this is how you did that. And it would be different for different countries depending on what you're looking at. So that's an example of full integration. So where they would share knowledge like, okay, we made our power plants more flexible, and this is how we made them, how they became more flexible. This is how we ramped up, or this is how we ramped down. And then also, yes, interconnections is what helped, for example, in a European perspective, which we don't necessarily have in a South African perspective. Maybe we're not as well interconnected, or, you know, so we would share such knowledge. So it's essentially sharing knowledge, but the countries make their own decision about what they do and how they do it. No, that's social. No. Where the question for those online, do you have knowledge on how to deal with strikes is the question. And the response is no, because we're simply a technical agency. So what we do is only provide technical assistance. Yeah.
Couple more questions.
It was one.
Mike.
Thank you for the great talk. I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wish me luck.
Yeah. So already talking about the projects that you guys are running in Mpumalanga and Limpopo for the wind energy program. Okay, so she mentioned wind energy what's this programs that they are developing in Mpumalanga and Limpopo. And I wanted to ask if are those products like other wind turbines manufactured here in South Africa? And if that is like a long-term strategy that is being in place. So like, is it going to be a more of integrated approach where you have fossil fuel burning and wind power? Or are you guys like planning on going fully green with this wind power? And yeah, can I just ask the next
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, great question. You guys, I love the questions in this room. We've got so many bright minds. So the response to that is, so what we're doing is measuring potential of the wind resource potential in that area. And what we would do is hand it over to the government. And I think that links to the question she was asking. So we don't make the decision on what technology mixes you should have in the grid. So that's a decision for the DMRE together with ESCOM to make. And in South Africa, you've got the integrated resource plan, and they publish in the integrated resource plan what technologies and what capacities. And it's that document as well as the ministry that guides what the technology mix of the country should be. And they do it via various arms. They've got, the procurement processes where I'm sure you've heard about it, where they're like, oh, there's a bid window that opens, there's bid window 1, and now we just had bid window 6 and bid window 7 is coming up. So they do procure various forms of energy, but we also have the utility. But basically the generation mix is decided by the countries. Also in the case of South Africa, we're simply providing a resource mapping to show which can be used by, for example, either developers, or that can be used by the DMRE itself, or whoever needs to look at it to see what the resource potentials in that area look. So it's essentially an enabler. And then your other question was with regards to the production of wind turbines. So as I know and I stand to be corrected, I don't think there are any companies right now in South Africa, because like the big players in the space in terms of wind turbine manufacturing are like companies like Vestas and so forth. So as I know, I don't think they've set up shop in South Africa, but they do have a presence in South Africa. But where that actual manufacturing is coming from could be that it's being shipped from where they're being manufactured currently. But I do know that also economic development is a big thing right in South Africa, and production of local content is something that's very important. And the DTI does make determinations on what percentages and what components should be locally manufactured. So there are other components in the general value chain that that are manufactured in South Africa, but maybe not necessarily, for example, in a cell or something of that sort, where certain components are locally assembled in some cases, and some are locally manufactured.
And then so in your LCOE comparison, which what is it? Energy producing method was the one that had higher costs. So
yeah. So that answer also differs by jurisdiction depending on where you are, right? Because it depends, like for example, it depends.
Okay, let's say here in South Africa.
Yeah, exactly. So it will depend where you are, depending on the cost of production and how much it costs to set that project up. But also when you look at LCOE, it's not only the technical that you look at, you also look at things like the interest rates, the cost of the lending for that project, what's your payback period. It also depends on the interest that the banks are giving in that region. And then that goes back to, for example, is that country a country where you actually can get a loan at a very cheap price, or is it expensive to get a loan in that country? So in a country like Denmark, it's much cheaper, interest rates are much lower, whereas maybe in a country like South Africa, our interest rates might be slightly higher. So all these components come into play. But what we see right now is that renewables are competitive regardless of where you look at. Solar, specifically solar PV, and as you saw from that as well, CSP is generally higher. So solar PV utility scale is currently very competitive, and wind, for example, in a Danish case, you've got very competitive offshore wind, but not in a country like South Africa, because offshore, because our escarpment goes very deep very quickly. So it's much difficult to actually have offshore wind. But then there's a study that was done by Stellenbosch, I think about in 2018, about well, it was 2018, how many years ago? But yeah, so in 2018, and that study showed that we actually had offshore wind potential that could power at that time's electricity demand about, I think, 8 times over or something of that sort. So about by 800% more production. If you went, I think, 1,000 meters into the shore, then it would be, I think, floating. So there's these comparisons and aspects that you'd have to look at. Whereas in a country like Denmark, offshore is quite competitive because the seabed is generally shallow. So, and the waters maybe are less more violent than they are. So, but in general, solar is right now where you, and because coal prices have also just skyrocketed with the general prices as well as gas prices. So we do see that it is competitive.
Okay, so yeah, it's my last question. So my last question is that we're really focused on decreasing the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit, and the main focus is usually it's usually energy. So that's what I'm seeing. But like in statistics, it shows that like 50% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted from energy producers and also agriculture. So since as South Africa, we have like coal reserves that can last us over 100 years, why don't we just develop technologies in agriculture to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions and use the safest routes instead of using coal? Like, why should we switch to greenhouse gases since we have this safe solution of coal? So yeah.
But so let's think about it. So you say safe, and then you say 100 years, right? And how old do you think an average person in South Africa in a normal context would live up to?
Maybe 67.
Right?
Okay.
Then times 2.
Times 2.
Yeah, if you say 60 years and then multiply by 2 for a second lifetime, the second generation, that's already above the 100 that you mentioned.
Yeah, but
so
yeah, okay. So my argument has always been that in this period of this 100 years, we'd be using these fossil fuels, and we will be selling them outside. So we'll be using these fossil fuels and the energy that we're producing to actually develop our own green technologies, so that we don't rush into anything.
Yeah.
And we have a much more sustainable approach to transition.
Yes.
So yeah, that was my idea.
Yeah. You make a valid point in terms of not rushing, and I think that's always something that we always say, because I mean, even in a Danish context, it took 40 years, right? It didn't happen overnight. So I think not rushing is the best way of not crashing, right? You don't want to rush anything because you want to ensure that you've looked at all the angles, the social as well, right? Because the different social contexts. What do you do about the jobs that are going to be lost in that industry? What do you do about, the value chains and the new jobs and the ripple effects? And not just the direct job, but also the indirect jobs. So there's it's a shift in an economy, essentially, that you're looking at when you speak about a transition. And I think part of, and maybe I should highlight that part of what we do is never to pick a technology based on, does it sound nice to the media? Does it sound not nice to the media? But to pick it based on technological merits. And that's where we look at things. We're neutral to everything else. And that's why we use models. Right, you can't tell a model that, I don't like coal, or no, I don't like. You simply put its technical inputs into it, including the price, because the economy, the economics is very important. And then what we're seeing, and this is what the models are showing us, and also in practice, is that in actual fact, it's quite competitive to actually develop renewables. But then of course, then there's things like storage and stuff like that then bring the complication to it, right? And that's why, as you are rightfully pointing out, it makes sense to do it on a step-by-step process, and ensuring that within, for example, within South Africa, it is the best to do. But then if we also look at the other side, which is let's look at our core resources. For example, we don't have oil resources or gas resources that we can rely on. So even if we develop gas, right, we're going to have to buy it elsewhere. We're going to have to, so we exposing ourselves to an energy security issue anyway, right? But then if you developed homegrown resources, regardless of what that resource is, and if you are sure that as you develop it, you are increasing your own security, because just the war in Ukraine has shown us that, for example, for countries like Denmark, how energy, how we're so dependent on certain countries for energy resources, fossil fuels basically. And if Saudi Arabia wakes up and says to South Africa, we're not bringing any more oil, what do? Right? Exactly. So that means, oh, we can't drive. It comes with standstill. And that's something that actually can happen, right? We've seen that it can happen. So the idea is not to say what's good or what's bad, but it's to say, how do we make ourselves secure in a way that we know that we are developing at the best rate, and also considering that, and the greenhouse gas emission problem that you bring up, climate change is not a local issue, it's a global issue. So what is linked to that discussion, and what we've heard come out in many discussions, is other countries saying, yeah, but well, you had your turn to emit, so now it's our turn to emit. And that's fair and fine, as long as you know that you'll succumb to the same effects that everyone will. So I think it's a time where, as a globe, we just need to realize that there's a lot of interdependencies from an energy perspective, and it's in the best interest of all of us, because the floods in KZN, right? Like, even if you didn't believe that it was happening and that greenhouse gas emissions had a problem, if we just look at the changes in climate and temperature locally, forget anywhere else, we're seeing these changes, and it's better to mitigate, right? Yeah, we're gonna adapt.
One more question from the floor on this one. Yeah.
My question is, I noticed that you partner with certain countries, but not all countries.
Yeah.
So what are some of the barriers that prohibit you from partnering with other countries? And also, what are the things that you consider when you are partnering with certain countries? And then a second question, the second question is, can students get involved, or at least acquire exposure in the energy sector? What can a student do apart from just reading about it in books or attending talks such as yours?
Okay, lovely question. Yeah, so the answer to the first question is that we in actual fact, even having the 24 that we have right now, it's seen as a stretch currently. So we do try to limit the number of countries that we partner with. We have more demand than we actually do have supply in this case. So, and that's basically because, and we pick the countries that we partner with based on technical expertise, the core competencies, because we don't ever want to dilute the quality of the work that we do. So we ensure that we do have the capacity to match the needs of that country based on the competencies of Denmark as an in-house. So that sort of helps us in terms of limiting, that already limits certain countries that we work with, but also just ensuring that also from a technical perspective, and like the technical resource is available to meet the demands of these different countries. And a lot of our technical partners, be it ourselves in-house or the partners that we work with, are actually constraints. It would be impossible to meet the demand. So yeah, and your second question was with regards to how do students plug in. So, so directly with us, it would be, for example, via talks such as this, but I know that different embassies, including our own, do have programs where they partner, but also platforms such as the UN, and there's a lot of organizations out there that do partner with different universities, or they have their own programs that they run where they do call youth to come in and be plugged in. And I think that's a good way of starting, just getting into the ecosystems and finding out what programs they are out there, and being a part of them. Sign up for these programs and go to the forums and speak to people. And as you speak to people, you start to learn more and to understand what opportunities exist in the sector. And just also following on, for example, as you mentioned, on the news and the internet, and just seeing what the trends are. But I think definitely do plug into some sort of forum or some body where you stay up to breast with the developments. And as you get exposed to more forms of information, you're able to decide what speaks best to you.
Thanks. Then let's end the question there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amanda, for a very good talk and lots of interesting discussion and questions afterwards. So yeah, thank you very much.